Good day to you. You're looking at an area at East Stroudsburg University's campus called the Quad. Not all of you in this class are at ESU, so you may not know about this space. You guys probably have something similar at your campuses, a square area in between dorms, the Quad. I mean, they could have put a building out there, this campus, but they didn't. And why is that? It's because this space right here is used for a common place for people to gather, mostly ESU people, for all kinds of events that are in the interests of the community. So you've got family weekend, for example, that happens out there. You've got club fair that happens out there. I remember one time a religious group came here to ESU and they were right over there where I have the phone posted in the corner, and they were yelling, some what a lot of people thought were a lot of rude comments to people as they walked by, especially about abortion. And right next to them, setting up camp, was the radio station from ESU that started playing music. And you had the two messages competing over. There was a very interesting use of that space, I thought, to have a clashing of ideas, and a clashing of ideas about values that people presumably would be interested in. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about places like that. That's a public sphere. Yeah, it's a place where everybody can walk into. There's no barrier. There's no cost of admission. There's no holes that you're going to fall into the ground. It's a space everybody can walk into and talk if you want to. And we have these spaces actually across the United States. Here in East Stroudsburg, we have a town. We have a town center with a council building and a street, Crystal Street, and some businesses. And that's sort of a square area. Stroudsburg has the same thing. You have Stroudsburg Square. They had a Christmas tree lighting going on. So we're talking about the idea of a public sphere today, but we are talking about the idea of a public sphere in the context of social media, and whether social media can be a public sphere for people to gather and to talk and to express opinions about common ideas. And in particular today, we're going to be looking at Twitter, the Twitterverse, and whether the Twitterverse presents that possibility to become a public sphere, a badly missing public sphere, a place where people can go without commercial interests and discuss ideas. So let's talk about Twitter. We're going to be featuring the work, or the criticism, I should say, and also the extrapolation of the German author today, Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas, it's his concept of the public sphere that Christian Fuchs takes on for the most part. Let's start, though, with what Twitter exactly is, what distinguishes it from Facebook as a social media platform. Twitter is actually a blog site. Some people call it a microblog. I think that the difference between blogs and microblogs is gone away. But officially, a blog is a website that features regular postings. They're posted periodically in reverse chronological order. So the most recent post is at the top, and then the new ones just keep adding on top and pushing the other ones down. A microblog, by contrast, is short messages that are shared with the public, and each user gets to see the followers of the person who's posting the message. So a microblog is short messages shared with the public, and each user can see the followers, can see the contacts. There are two main blogging platforms across the world that are the most popular. One is Twitter, and the second one is the Chinese one called Weibo. Weibo. Now, there are those who claim that the revolutions, as the entry point into this chapter to start to talk about whether Twitter can actually serve as a public sphere, the Fuchs brings up that there are those who talk about the revolutions that took place in the Middle East. I don't know if you remember them, a little bit before your time. You were in high school, for most of you. And those revolutions were in Egypt and Tunisia, and there were also possibilities of revolutions elsewhere, Syria and Saudi Arabia. Not much of a chance, but there was talk about it. And these revolutions were called Twitter revolutions in some way. They were called Twitter revolutions, which is implying that Twitter created a new public space where people could discuss the inequities in the current governmental system and decide to come together and overthrow those governments. So that's the question that Fuchs wants to examine. Is Twitter all that it's cracked up to be? Is it a public sphere? So now let's move to Habermas and what his conception of a public sphere is. A public sphere, let's start with the definition this way. Occasions, things that happen, occasions are public when they are open to everybody. Therefore, a public sphere, in order to be public, must be open to everybody.
The purpose of the public sphere is to talk about the common. What is common to all of us? To talk about the common good, to talk about common ground. What are issues, for example, that are unique to college students as a community that you would want to talk about? Student loan debt, that might be one. General education requirements, that might be another concern. Parking, those are probably universal concerns to all students across just about every university in the US. And so those are issues that you should be able to discuss in a public sphere as it exists on social media. The dimensions specifically are the public sphere. There are several of them. You can read them in the book that Habermas trots out, but the two main ones are that there is a formation of public opinion that takes place. A public opinion about student loan debt and how to handle it. A public opinion about whether parking is an issue at ESU. There's an opinion that is a kind of consensual opinion that arrives at when the public discusses things together and people start to coalesce around the direction of a certain opinion. So that's one dimension of a public sphere. And then the second dimension is that all citizens, as we mentioned earlier, have access. Other dimensions include unrestricted conferences. That means that what you're talking about in the public sphere should not be censored. It should not be blocked out by commercial interests. It should be unrestricted. And finally, that there should be a debate that takes place over the general rules of discussion. That there's some kind of procedure that's talked about how are we going to discuss what we want to discuss so that it's not a free-for-all, so that it's not chaos. All right, so now let's start to critique the public sphere from various areas of academia, various areas of research, because Habermas's public sphere has been critiqued. And then when we get to the end of this, now we're going to have a nicely shaped conception of public sphere that we can see whether it applies on Twitter. So let's criticize it for now. First, there's a working class critique, and this critique says that Habermas focused on the bourgeois. Did you see that word in the chapter? It's a word that you probably heard before somewhere in life and wondered, what is that? It's a fancy French word. The bourgeois refers to those educated, wealthy people in French society that were knowledgeable, and they were the ones who were trying to stimulate discussion amongst the public. And they are the ones who were looked to as the leaders, since they had the education, they had the knowledge, they had the money, they were the ones who looked up to for opinions. They are part of a capitalist society, that a capitalist society always creates a bourgeois, or if you want to look at it, wealthy class, people who are above middle class and upper class. So the working class critique of the public sphere is that it has not been open to the working class for reasons that we will talk about later in this lecture, that most of the public sphere has been accessed by wealthy, educated people, and that the working class are excluded. Next up, as a criticism or a critique of the public sphere, is the feminist critique, which is not just speaking about gender issues. It's actually criticizing the public sphere from the point of view that it excludes people of different sexuality, people of different genders, people of different ethnicities, and people of different income backgrounds. And as part of this feminist critique, Fuchs jumps in and critiques the feminist critique, because he says that what the feminist critique asks for is there should be as many public arenas for discussions about issues of public concern. There should be as many public arenas, many public spheres, I should stay with the correct terminology, as possible, and as many social media platforms. And Fuchs says, no. That splinters the media. There need to be a few broad section, a cross-section media with lots of people joined in, rather than splintering public sphere discussions, because then you can't really coagulate a public opinion. Next up is a criticism of the public sphere that's offered by people who are critiquing its cultural imperialism. It's cultural imperialism, which is saying that the West, Western societies, which would be the United States, it would be Europe, as opposed to Eastern societies, Middle East, Asia. Western societies use the concept of the public sphere to impose their political and economic and social systems on other countries, saying that our notion of the public sphere is how it should be in China, not your notion. Our notion of the public sphere should include corporations and private investment, and that's what one criticism is about it with Habermas's public sphere. It's totally biased towards Western influences. And to illustrate this point, if you look at broadcasting as a potential public sphere, I mean, TV, what's the reach of TV is incredible. The Super Bowl is going to reach over half of the American population here in February. And so broadcasting presents a great possibility for a worldwide discussion, a worldwide public sphere, if you will, but broadcasting is mostly national. You turn on your TV, you're not going to find any programs from Britain, hardly any. You might find an old Monty Python rerun, but nothing from Canada, nothing from Mexico. It's typical like that across the world. Broadcasting systems are mostly national. So there is no global public sphere on social media. There's no global public sphere because there is imperialism that's taking place. That's what this criticism says, that the Western notion of the public sphere is ideologically driven. It's presenting a public sphere as having private capitalistic interests in, is presenting as talking about democratic ideas, as long as you're not talking about communism or socialism. You get my drift, right? So there's a lot of restriction on that public sphere. It's imperialist. Imperialist, the powerful Western countries, Britain, the United States, pushing our notion on the rest of the world. Also, the critique of the public sphere from the imperialism vantage point is that the public sphere is not just about whether the discussion is taking place on a social media platform. It's also about who owns the public media. And Twitter is a privately owned company, just like Facebook is a privately owned company. So the media have to be owned by the public as well to be a truly public sphere entity. And there's also the criticism, still under cultural imperialism, is that public spheres do exist across the world. You can find, if you go to Britain, for example, the pub is like a public sphere. That's where people go. It's even public house, pub. It's in that same general spirit. You can find tea houses in China. So it's not that public spheres don't exist in real physical space. Another criticism of cultural imperialism. It's not that there aren't opportunities in the U.S. in these town squares and the quads and the commuter lounges at universities. These are all places where public spheres could exist. It's that social media is not the only way that you can express opinion and bring about a discussion that's in the interest of the public. So in other words, the public sphere is not just a domain, but it's also a space, and it's a process of discussion and a space simultaneously. And ultimately, what social media should be doing, if it's trying to be a public sphere, according to this criticism, is to foster participatory democracy. Remember, participatory democracy, it's taking democracy and spreading it to those areas that exist outside of just voting, spreading it to the home, spreading it to gender relations, spreading it to the way that decisions are made at universities. It's supposed to spread democracy everywhere. So it's about fostering participatory democracy rather than economic and state power, which is what is being fostered in social media today. Let's move on now. Let's move on to public sphere as imminent critique. I don't know if you know that word as it was used in one of the headings in this chapter. Imminent means something is bound to happen. It's not, you can't stop. It's bound to happen. Imminent critique. So in capitalist society, the public sphere is automatically exclusory. It's automatically exclusory because if you don't have the money, if you don't have the balance of power, if you're not a member of the social media platform, if you don't already have a high attention economy amongst your followers, you're not going to have the same kind of access to the public sphere as others. So the public sphere in a capitalist society is necessarily going to be exclusory, and it can't be a full-fledged public sphere. And ironically, once again, to point out that the quote, liberal freedoms that we celebrate in this country, freedoms of speech, opinion, association, who we're allowed to associate with, and assembly, those are undermined by capitalism for all the reasons that we've been talking about in this course, and the way that social media is trying to successfully commodifying the audience and turning communication into commodification. So in other words, what's imminent about the public sphere is it creates its own critique. It creates its own critique by virtue of being in a capitalist system. And the questions that are raised by Fuchs cannot be put better by me, for sure. So I'm going to ask these questions. These are questions that you should ask of whether a public sphere is operating as a public sphere. And you should be analyzing the political economic dimension first. The political economic dimension includes the ownership. Is there democratic ownership of the media organization and the resources? Next, you can question the censorship. Is there political and or economic censorship? I can tell you what, Disney is not going to allow any bad stuff to be said about Mickey Mouse on any of its websites. I can tell you that right there. Next up is exclusion. Is there an over-representation of viewpoints of corporate elites or of uncritical and pro-capitalist viewpoints? To which degree are critical viewpoints present? And finally, political content production. Who can produce the content? How visible, relevant, and influential is the produced content? Those are all questions about the political economic dimension of social media. But then there's a second dimension, and I should have introduced this earlier in my video lecture today, because Habermas is saying that the public sphere is about two main dimensions. One is the political economic dimension, and the other one is about political communication, which is to say communication about politics. So that's what I want to address right here. In analyzing the public sphere from a political communication standpoint, you're asking, is there universal access? How relevant, frequently used are political communication sites or political communication forums within more general platforms? Who has access and who uses the sites for political communication? Income, education level, age, gender, ethnicity, origin. How relevant is the political communication in relation to other forms of communication, such as entertainment? Who has access and who uses the sites for political communication? Independence. How independent are the sites and discussions from economic and state interests? And finally, quality of political discussion. How valid, inclusive, attentive, sincere, reflexive, and inclusive is the political online discussion? Those are questions that are offered as part of the critique as a public sphere as a critique of the public sphere, which is offering its own imminent critique. It collapses under its own weight. Now let's move to commercialization, commercial media and the public sphere, I should say. And Habermas was a strong critic of advertising being involved in media at all, because he said that advertising is going to depoliticize the public sphere. It's automatically going to depolitize. It's going to cause people not to be interested in politics, to think they're not relevant, to try and merchandise politics. I mean, when you have President's Day weekend coming around here in the United States, and when's that, in January, February? I think it's January, President's Day weekend. You're going to have all kinds of auto dealers doing President's Weekend ad. Now, they're just merchandising the idea of the presidency. That's not a political discussion. That's what goes on when you have capitalism that's entered into the public sphere. One of the authors that Fuchs calls upon is James Curran. James Curran is a British thinker, and he said that there used to be a lot more radical press, a lot more radical media in Britain. And that's the case of the United States as well. There used to be a lot more. I don't really care for the term radical. It's not really a term that's palatable to the average American. It seems too severe, too outrageous, too outside of the mainstream. Really what we're talking about is alternative media, alternative sites. Even here at ESU, when I first came here 25 years ago, there was a parody newspaper that was produced every week called Stroud Henge. Stroud is building on campus, Stroud Henge. And it was parroting all the news that was being reported in the official newspaper, the Stroud Courier. And you just don't find many examples like that anywhere. It's even, you can't get on a bus or metro and find a metro alternative newspaper much anymore. And the same is true in social media as well. So Habermas was very critical of advertising because that's what happens. The financial interests get into the content and they start to screen out those opinions, those viewpoints, the content that is not going to be making money, that's not going to meet supply and demand paradigm models. So in other words, media can only be public sphere media if they are not privatized and they are non-commercial. And the ways specifically that capitalism limits the public sphere, just to make sure we hammer those home, is media concentration. We've already talked about in this class how WhatsApp, for example, that's not existing by itself anymore. It bought up by Facebook. YouTube doesn't exist anymore, bought up by Google. So you have concentration of ownership. You also have the commercialization and tabloidization of content. Content is geared towards entertainment. It's much less offensive to people. Much less offensive to people is good for advertisers. They don't want people being offended by content. So content gravitates towards entertainment and sports and not politics. And finally, you have power inequalities for reasons that we've talked about in this course, social stratification, for example, and asymmetrical power. All right, moving on now, let's talk about capitalist media, public media, and civil society media. Let's talk about 3 different ways you can set up media. You may not be as familiar with these other 2 as you would be if you were living in other countries, because the US is so heavily capitalistic and so much of the media landscape is profit making. But I can assure you in other parts of the world, there are these other models that exist as well. So the first is the idea that capitalist media is privately owned media, owned by individuals, owned by families, owned by shareholders. It's interesting, not companies, but shareholders own the companies, but they're private media. That's capitalist media. Then we have public media. Public media are funded by the state and sometimes run by the state. And sometimes those public media are therefore not in the best interest of the people because they are propaganda from the state. But the idea is you don't have private enterprise funding the media, you have the state. So we'll find that in Korea, we'll find that in communist China, we'll find that in Russia, we'll find that in Cuba. Find that in the US. We have PBS, publicly funded media, funded by the government. And then you have civil society media. Civil society media, it's in opposition to the capitalistic logic, and it is run by citizens only. There's a radio station in Allentown called WDIY for Do It Yourself. It's run entirely by the communities. They raise money through sponsorships, and they run the radio station. That's what we're talking about here. Is there that kind of entity in social media? Go ahead, answer. Answer with a social medium that's a civil society. Answer with a social media platform that's a civil society media. I'll give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Couldn't do it, could you? All right, let's go on now to talk about all of the social media in terms of their categories so that we can make sure that we are considering the vast range of social media out there and what the potential is for a public sphere. So we have WordPress, which is a kind of blog. In fact, there are many kinds of blogs. You've got WordPress. I have a blog that I create using my WordPress. You've got Blogspot. That's another software program for blogs. And then you've got Tumblr. Tumblr, which is basically a social media site, a platform that we haven't talked about in this class, is basically a blog. And then you have wiki sites. These are community sites where people contribute knowledge onto the page. So you've got Wikipedia, you've got other Wiki sites as well out there. Then you have SNSs, or social networks, as we talked about, and then those are going to be all the Facebooks and the Instagrams. So this is the wide range of social media that's out there. And now let's address other authors who Fuchs brings up to try and understand various dimensions of the public sphere before we get to talking about Twitter. So the next author is Ziki Papakaris. I'm not sure how to say her name, but she talked about the private sphere. And she advanced an approach that said that political activities that were formerly in the public sphere have now moved to the private sphere. And the private sphere now, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the Twitters, the Google Pluses, they're basically operating as a public sphere today because there's so many people that can get in there and voice opinions. However, Fuchs says that Papakaris ignores that physical spaces are important to public spheres. That if you looked at the Egyptian uprising and successful revolution, most of the discussion took place in cafes, in squares, at people's houses, in school buildings, that you need physical space, that being on the web is not just enough. And that social media cannot fake spatio-temporal presence. That's presence of people in a space discussing things in a public sphere. And that the notion of a network public is actually apolitical by its very nature of getting on to a network, and especially because that network is controlling everybody who can communicate with you because they have to be on the network, it's naturally apolitical. Next up is an author by the name of Jody Dean. Jody Dean, she talked about social media politics as ideology. Social media politics as ideology. What she meant by that is that the internet is actually a fetish that advances post-politics. Now, that's a really kind of strange statement. The internet is a fetish that advances post-politics. So we're past politics. We're not interested in them anymore. What we're interested in is buying things. What we're interested in doing is gossiping about celebrities. What we're interested in doing is sharing how great our lives are going. Politics, gone. So that's what a fetish is, right? It's something that's presented as normal that can't be changed. And that's how we accept the internet. Oh, it'll never become a place where we can have real political discussion. And she also said, Jody Dean, that the internet makes you feel that you're involved because you've clicked something, because you've donated $5, but you haven't put the time, the energy, the blood, the sweat, the lack of sleep into it. So it makes you feel the internet, and by extension, therefore, social media, it makes you feel. It makes you feel like you're making an effort, but it's very tiny, right? Next up is Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell talked about social media, and he talked about how there are no natural enemies in social media of the status quo. Okay, that one's a little bit harsh, but what he's talking about is when you risk your life in a protest, and this is going to be beyond the scope of what many of you will ever have to live in because you live in a stable country, but who knows? Who knows what's going to happen with impeachment? But the U.S. so far has been a stable country. You're not really caught up in a lot of protests unless you're around during Vietnam, or unless you were in part of the Me Too movement, or unless you're part of the Occupy movement. There are not that many protests that happen at ESU. When you protest, it takes courage, and especially if your life is at risk in countries where you can become imprisoned or beat. And so that builds courage, and it also builds trust among members. And you cannot substitute for that in online media. You have strong social ties. And actually, social media is built around weak social ties. I mean, what the hell? I have a friend who I accepted their friend request yesterday. I've never even met him. That's not a friend. Okay, I accepted him because I know they're a business person in town here, and I guess they want a connection with a professor. I don't know. And so they sent me a friend request. I accepted them. They're not my friend. I have a whole column on friends and rounding some corners, but the whole word friend has been perverted in many ways. And ties on social media, except for family and really, really tight friends that you have in-person bonds with, they get defriended all the time. They get unfollowed all the time. You get blocked all the time. That's how loose social ties are on social media. Next up is the Russian thinker Evgeny Morozov. And not much to say here. He's basically continuing on this line of thought. He says social media activism is not activism, it's slacktivism. It's clicktivism. Says it all, right? All right, now let's talk about some of the weaknesses of Twitter as we start to head into Twitter to consider the question of whether it can operate as a public sphere. And one problem with it is there is stratification. Fuchs did an analysis of the typical Twitter user. I don't know if it's changed since his data was collected in 2015, but the average person on Twitter is 18 to 34. Now, if you're a Twitter user, that describes you in this class. The average person has a university degree or is in process of gaining a university degree. That's you. The average person has no children. That's some of you in this class. So Twitter is stratified. It's not open. I mean, maybe open to everybody, but not everybody is using it. So on that count, not a public sphere. Next up, there's an asymmetry of power on Twitter. An asymmetry of power on Twitter. Only 7% of the top Twitter trend topics, only 7% were political trending topics. 7%. So there's no communication, or little communication, going on Twitter. The most used hashtags, at least when Fuchs did his study, were music and dating. Dating was what was mostly hashtagged on Twitter. And overall, celebrities dominate, sports figures dominate, alternative political figures have very, very few followers. So there's that whole side of Twitter. It's asymmetrical in its power because the power is in the hands of the people who are already famous, and the people who have money, and the people who are 18 to 34 at college. And then also the way that Twitter works is somewhat different from Facebook. I mean, with Facebook, you have sharing that goes on, but much of Twitter is about retweeting. And so that's taking a message that's already been put on there and just distributing it, right? So retweeting is really more about amplifying a single voice than bringing new voices in. And it leads to further stratification because the voices that are already popular on Twitter just get amplified even more because the way that people interact on Twitter is mostly to retweet. Isn't that interesting? All right, now let's move on to talking about interactivity. Interactivity of political communication, I should say. on Twitter? Is there political communication? Is there discussion that goes on about politics? So there was a study done of WikiLeaks, the incident involving Julian Assange. I don't know if you know about him. He leaked a bunch of information about the U.S. government, later about the Clinton campaign. That's in debate. He was very much caught up in the Donald Trump-Hillary Clinton campaign and his role about the information they provide about Hillary Clinton. And there was a study done of WikiLeaks and also of the Egyptian Revolution, trying to study the role of political communication in Twitter. And they found that more than 50% of the postings across the time period in which this WikiLeaks incident happened, and also the Egyptian Revolution, across that time period, 50% of the tweets were repostings. So that's no new discussion. That's taking something that somebody is already put out there and sent out. So Twitter, according to Fuchs, is mostly one-way communication. It's not two-way. It's mostly one-way. It's coming from somewhere and then being boosted and continued on down the line. Which leads Fuchs to conclude that Twitter is really nothing more than an information system for spreading content and links. It's about spreading. It's not about discussion. It's not about opinion formation. You can decide that for yourself. All right, let's now move on to an area that we haven't really addressed in this class. It certainly occurs across all areas of social media. I can see that I'm going to be at the end of my video here for my time length on my phone, so I'm going to stop the video here with that tease and ask you to pick up on video number 2.